5 years after World War II, peace is once again threatened. The new enemy is communism. Only one man stands between the West and disaster. But will he use the ultimate weapon? On the border between North and South Korea, night watch was nearly over. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. June the 25th, 1950, the Korean War had begun. South Korean soldiers fled for their lives as communist troops from the north stormed across the 38th parallel into the south. Once part of Japan's huge empire, Korea was set free by the Allies at the end of the Second World War. It was then split in two, with a border drawn along the 38th parallel. Soviet forces occupied north of the parallel, and United States troops the south. The Koreans welcomed all the Allies, both the communist Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. After 35 years of unpopular Japanese rule, at last, the Koreans were free. They were going to enjoy their independence. Expecting no trouble in Korea, the United States pulled out their troops. They left behind a young democracy with an ill-equipped, unmotivated army. But in the north, the Soviets had set up a communist government which was determined to reunite Korea under its own rule. The weekend of the attack, United States President Harry Truman was relaxing at his home in Missouri.
Well,
an urgent call came from Washington.
what was this?
Bad news. North Korean communists had entered the South in a full-scale invasion. Truman knew that this could be the start of World War III. 5 years before, Truman had decided to deploy the most terrifying weapon yet seen. With his consent, the United States had defeated Japan by dropping 2 atomic bombs. Nuclear weapons had won the war for America, but would change the nature of warfare forever. Japan formally surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander Allied powers in the Pacific Theater. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and America entered World War II, MacArthur had been chosen to lead the war in the Pacific. And so it was MacArthur who accepted Japan's surrender on board the USS Missouri in August 1945.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
MacArthur never forgot that it was the atomic bomb that achieved the surrender with such speed. MacArthur remained in Japan to supervise the occupation. Truman and MacArthur disliked each other intensely. MacArthur considered Truman an appeaser and an opportunist, while Truman knew MacArthur as an arrogant warmonger with no political sense. But MacArthur was the most senior American field commander in the Far East. Truman had to use him. At the age of 70, with 50 years of service behind him, General MacArthur was going back to war. The defense of Korea would be seen as a symbol of the free world's determination to resist communism. MacArthur believed it was his destiny to lead that fight. For him, communism was the embodiment of all that was evil. Truman immediately committed U.S. air and naval support to help the South Korean army. Only then did he inform the American people of the gravity of the situation.
We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
There was no time to be lost. Within days, communist forces were threatening South Korea's capital, Seoul. The United Nations Security Council was summoned to an emergency session. For the first time in its history, it resolved to take joint military action. General Macarthur was appointed commander of all United Nations forces. He raced to Korea to assess the situation. 20 miles south of Seoul, he commandeered a jeep and headed for the front line. He was appalled by what he saw. Abandoning their homes, South Korean refugees were streaming past him in their thousands. They were joined by the weak and ill-equipped South Korean army. For them too, retreat was the only option. Their faces told the sad story. South Korea's capital, Seoul, had already been taken by the enemy. At 5 a.m. Washington time, just 4 days after the invasion, President Truman was standing by. He was ready to act on MacArthur's recommendations. The message was alarming. MacArthur felt that without the immediate introduction of the United Nations ground forces, South Korea would be doomed. He cabled Washington, "Our estimate is that a complete collapse is imminent." A week after the invasion, United States planes were once again being prepared for active service. Thousands of young men were drafted. American forces already in Japan were rushed to reinforce the demoralized South Korean army. The first men to arrive thought they'd only be away for a few days. One glimpse of American might would be enough to scare the communists back across the 38th parallel. But in that first week of July 1950, just a few hundred bewildered and lightly armed American soldiers were stretched along the front line. The UN build-up would take time. Few of these GIs had seen combat before. Their orders were to delay the North Koreans until reinforcements arrived. On July the 7th, the Americans fired their first mortar shells into enemy lines. But the response was overwhelming. A few inexperienced GIs with little air support gave the communists no problems. That day, America experienced her first casualties of the war. Facing the communists on the battlefield for the first time, the United States forces were being annihilated. Retreating through endless paddy fields, the Americans wondered what on earth they were doing in this alien country. What were they fighting for? By the end of July, United Nations forces had been pushed all the way to the southeastern tip of Korea. The 8th Army was holding on, but only just. It was now that General MacArthur would show his military genius with a daring plan. He would strike deep behind enemy lines, cut off the enemy supply routes, and win this war with one bold stroke. The entire United Nations force was now trapped within the Pusan perimeter. With extraordinary daring, MacArthur planned to bring fresh troops direct from Japan and stage an amphibious landing at Incheon, miles behind enemy lines. Once Incheon was his, he would be positioned to retake the capital city, Seoul, only 20 miles to the east. On September the 3rd, Operation Chromite was underway. A huge armada set sail in a raging typhoon. 70,000 men huddled below deck. It was a race against time. September the 15th was the only day that the tides would be high enough to land at Incheon. And the weather was getting worse. First, Macarthur needed to seize a tiny island called Walmi-do, which guarded all approaches to Incheon. It was heavily fortified. All night, heavy naval guns relentlessly bombarded the island. Miraculously, when daybreak came, the typhoon had cleared. As the first landing craft began to head for the shore, General Macarthur watched the unfolding of his master plan. He knew they risked being stranded on the mudflats if the tide turned. Macarthur had to wait for 9 hours, until, with the evening tide, the main United Nations force could land. No match for this strength, the North Koreans quickly surrendered. Operation Chromite had worked. United Nations soldiers strip-searched their prisoners. They had already found out that fanatical communists would surrender with a hidden hand grenade strapped to their bodies. The town of Incheon itself fell with hardly a shot being fired. General MacArthur's next objective was to retake Seoul. For 5 long days, Seoul was ravaged, as every building became a battleground. Communist snipers held on to the last. Finally, the streets belonged to the American tanks. MacArthur had given Seoul back to the South Koreans. He persuaded Washington to give him permission for his army to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. But Truman ordered him not to approach within 20 miles of the Chinese border at the far north of Korea. Washington was increasingly nervous that communist China might join the war. This, in turn, could result in Soviet intervention. At last, 4 months after North Korea had stormed into the south, United Nations forces were taking the war across the 38th parallel into North Korea. Back in Washington, Truman was coming under increasing fire from the right for his supposed softness on communism. Feeling that some of MacArthur's popularity would rub off on him, he invited the general to what was supposed to be a private meeting on Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific. First to arrive on the island was MacArthur, accompanied only by his military staff. But when Truman arrived, it was with a plane load of photographers and journalists. When Truman stepped down to the tarmac to be greeted by his field commander, MacArthur did not salute. He shook hands as an equal. MacArthur had immediately understood Truman's real reason for the meeting. This was just a photo opportunity for a beleaguered president. Their smiles had been for the press only. In truth, they could hardly bear to talk to each other. For more than an hour, MacArthur went over his battle plans for the taking of North Korea. Finally, Truman had only one question. Would the Chinese invade? MacArthur assured him that the threat had passed. He was furious at the waste of his time. From now on, he'd run the war his own way. MacArthur's next target was Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. From his plane, he watched his men parachute behind enemy lines. He took Pyongyang with ease, and it was now that he determined to proceed right up to the Chinese border with all the forces at his command, in direct defiance of President Truman's orders. He was tired of Washington's caution. Nobody would dare challenge him. United Nations forces were now approaching the very frontiers of the vast Communist Republic of China. As they surged northwards, they took more and more prisoners. But as Korea's bitter winter drew on, behind the tattered North Koreans, there began to appear a different type of enemy. Dressed in quilted weatherproof uniforms, these soldiers were disciplined fighters. It was beginning to look as though Truman's fears would be justified. The Chinese were indeed becoming involved. On November the 28th, 1950, a massive human killing machine swarmed out of North Korean mountains. The Chinese had slipped 250,000 well-trained men over the border and seemed not to care how many died. For the United Nations forces, retreat was the only option. But now, they had the Korean winter to contend with. Thousands lost their lives to the enemy. But unprepared for the howling winds and snow, and in temperatures around 25 degrees below zero, many simply died of cold. All the territory that Macarthur had won since the Incheon landing was lost. By the 15th of December, the 8th Army had been pushed back across the 38th parallel. Macarthur was humiliated. He had underestimated the enemy's size and their intentions. His reputation was in ruins, and he wanted revenge. In his rage, he turned to the ultimate weapon. He demanded that he be allowed to use the atomic bomb. By December the 24th, he had finalized and submitted his plans. He needed 26 atomic bombs. He would target sites in North Korea and Manchuria, and cities as far away as Peking and Busan in China, Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, and many others. They would all be annihilated. Macarthur waited for a response. His plans were being considered. Meanwhile, the war dead were now arriving home. The American people were sick of the war. The pressure to use nuclear weapons was becoming irresistible. At that moment, it seemed that President Truman was seriously considering using the atom bomb. He ordered dummy nuclear runs over North Korea. In the winter of 1950, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. The United States was no longer the only atomic power. Since 1949, the Soviet Union under Stalin had been conducting its own nuclear tests. Prime Minister Attlee of Great Britain flew to Washington to persuade the president that nuclear war could mean the end of civilization. But suddenly, the situation on the battlefield changed. Low on supplies and with staggering losses, the Chinese came to a halt in mid-January. Immediately, the United Nations went back on the offensive. The longest retreat in American history had ended. As Macarthur toured the front line, the message came. Truman was hoping to negotiate a ceasefire. There would be no all-out war with Red China. Nuclear weapons would not be deployed. Macarthur's plans had been rejected by the administration. Macarthur continued to goad the administration with public threats to bring the Chinese to heel. They must surrender or face the consequences. The stage was set for the final showdown with Truman. The big general in the Far East had gone too far. He had to go. Truman's advisors and chiefs of staff were all in agreement. He would be told officially on April the 11th. In fact, Macarthur learned of his dismissal from a radio broadcast heard by his aide. Millions knew before he did.
It is with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
In firing MacArthur, Truman had finally said no to all-out war with China. But to most American people, MacArthur was the hero. The Korean War dragged on for another 2 years. During that time, the United Nations casualties rose to 140,000, including 33,000 American dead. 1.5 million communist soldiers lost their lives. There was no victory for either side. The country was devastated, but when the armistice was signed on July the 23rd, 1953, the truce line had hardly moved from the 38th parallel. Japan was the only winner. Its economy fueled by the United Nations war effort, it was now firmly on course to becoming one of the greatest economic powers of the century. The Korean War had seen the end of two great men. 6 months before the ceasefire, President Truman finally stood down. And yet, as he made his farewell speech from the Oval Office, he was still able to say that the decision to go into Korea was the most important of his time in office. Korea had been the turning point in the Cold War. For the first time, free nations had met the test.
We have no regret. We feel we have done our best in the public service. I hope and believe we have contributed to the welfare of the nation and to the peace of the world. And now the time has come for me to say good night and God bless you.
The world also understood for the first time that in the nuclear age, all-out war would bring total destruction. And so the atomic bomb became the great deterrent. After Korea, nuclear weapons brought an uneasy peace between the superpowers. The alternative was too horrific to contemplate.